Both of them, the project that they're presenting today was just published. And so they're going to be presenting it to you. So if you love this project a lot, I would encourage you to purchase a copy because it is gorgeous. You can find out more information online. So without further ado, please give these two a round of applause.
Thank you all for coming to listen to Phil and I talk about Wig Heavier Than a Boot. Thank you to Emporia State and the Department of Art and Morgan for bringing us in. We're excited to be here and we're excited to talk about this collaborative project. And during this lecture, we'll kind of weave in some influences. We'll talk about questions that arose while we were making this project and kind of try to frame a way to experience the poetry later tonight. I'm looking forward to some hot cocoa. That's awesome. But before we get into the project, I kind of wanted to talk about, Philip and I went to grad school at Washington University in St. Louis. We knew each other in the creative community. Philip was a curator at the Pulitzer Art Foundation, and various projects kind of interweaved. But it wasn't until 2014 when this project would really take root. That summer in 2014, we would take part of a workshop and artist residency entitled Float, Collective Isolation with Radical Intention. It took place for a week in August 2014 on a peaceful country retreat, situated on about 160 acres of Black River property next to the Johnson Shut-ins or Elephant Rocks, if you're familiar with Missouri's geography. The guest group leaders were Italian collective Radical Intention, and together they shared activities that led workshops entitled Does This Group Have a Spokesperson? With artists, writers, curators, and activists from across the nation. This retreat focused on consensus practice, listening techniques, and group working, Radical Intention's selection of activities aimed to engage the group collectively, physically, mentally, and subconsciously. Activities included an all-day float trip. In the evenings, we began a joint reading of Luigi Pirandello's play, Six Actors in Search of an Author, which would become the backdrop to the week and also a subconscious influence to Wig Heavier Than a Boot. The final event in the evenings, each participant would present their own personal research and projects. In the mornings, we would start discussions of our shared dreams in previous evenings' conversations, generally followed by acting warm-up exercises, and then spending more time rereading each act of Pirandello's play. Together, we collectively jointly authored a perspective that gained from that week, which highlighted our new interest, the group's new interest in radical optimism. Radical optimism, read and listen. Find mindful time, time for learning, sharing, and faith in others. Create spaces for conversations without preconceptions, and games without expectations. Solitary experience made common experience as an act or practice. Relinquish. Be comfortable as leader and follower. Trust and laugh. Play and practice otherness. Change roles and navigate challenging terrain without instruction. Ride the tiger. It was during one of these participant conversations around a campfire that I would ask Phil if he is interested in working with a photographer. A very astute curator observed, Phil, Dave's asking you to collaborate, and Phil said yes.
So in 2012, I started noticing an image, petal, lowercase, that recurred over and over in my poems, almost as if I was having a recurring dream. And I thought, okay, that's interesting, but I didn't necessarily know what to make of it. Soon thereafter, I wrote an anaphoric poem. Anaphora means that every line of a poem or every stanza of a poem begins with the same line. In this case, the petal stirred and, the petal stirred and. And in that stirring, the petal as an image released all of this undercurrent of ideas. And so the petal stirred and it became a ram. The petal stirred and it dreamed that it was dew. The petal stirred a bold red skull, etc. In 2013, suddenly petal appeared capitalized. And I sort of recognized it as a kind of creative energy that the poems were trying to give me. In other words, I recognized Petal in the way that I might recognize an archetype that I had drawn from my tarot deck. Later in 2013, Petal actually spoke, and I recognized her as a distinct personality that had something to do with me and also had a life of her own. In 2014, during Float, Dave and I started talking about a collaboration. I had seen an exhibition of Dave's work at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, where he had photographed the interiors of the board members' homes. And around that time, I was having a question about where does Petal live? And so when Dave asked me, do you want to collaborate? I thought, yes, this is the person that I need to help me answer this question. I need someone to help me envision where Petal is going to live. So that's sort of the backstory, and now I'll read you the project statement. That is sort of the official record of what this collaboration is. So Way Heavier Than a Boot brings together photography by David and poetry by me. Revealing Petal, a drag consciousness is whom I manifest to write, and David photographs. The project crosses art-making rituals with isolated performances within domestic spaces and pastoral landscapes. Taken together, the resulting photographs and poems reveal dynamic relationships between poet, persona, and observer. By articulating a specific creative process in which one identity becomes two, the project in turn opens up a conversation about gender expression through an art historical lens. The photographs provide one record of poet and persona, blurring art historical masculine and feminine postures. The poems provide another, which elaborate upon the lived experience of being, modeling, and sometimes obscuring Petal. Subverting the ekphrastic literary tradition, my poems do not respond to David's photographs nor vice versa. Rather, both forms are made in the present. As David directs the shoot, I make performance notes that give way to a poem. The photographs capture the blend or distinction between me and Petal, and the poems hybridize our perspectives, enacting a relationship that is surreal, empowering, and sometimes unbearable, as the project title suggests. What is always constant is a sense of a person wanting to belong to the place that hosts them, whether that's farmland in rural Wisconsin, the coast of North Carolina, where I'm from, an art museum in St. Louis, where David mentioned I work, a small church, even or especially when the social norms of that place are felt to ostracize them. Both photographs and poems balance narrative with fragmentation and invite multiple interpretations.
So in conversations, especially about how do we reference this art historical lens, as a photo educator, I'm steeped in photo history. I'm interested in quoting from our medium. And so I wanted to show two examples of how we've kind of overlapped with the history of the medium and what these images have meant. So I'd like to introduce American Victoria's F. Holland Day work, The Vision, Orpheus scene. The image I've taught from for darkroom manipulation assignments functions as a guide of navigating the body within landscape and gesture while referencing a Greek myth. The photographer's assistant, Nicola Ginicola, is nude with hands behind his head, elbows reaching upward, the spine curved towards the entrance of the cave, flanked by a tree and a bed of rocks. These Orpheus series photographs pose nude male youths in costume in settings to evoke ancient Greeks. To quote Sean Michelle Smith in her article, Photography Between Desire and Grief, this is what Michelle wrote, the portion of the Orpheus myth that Day elects to represent is one of longing and despair, one of despair and grief. The great singer has just lost his beloved Eurydice to Hades forever. His fateful look back to ensure her safety crossing into the world of the living has condemned his lover to the realm of shades. Desire and grief are overt themes in this photograph, but desire also figures covertly here. Rather than a husband's desire to lose his wife, is not only a desire of the image evokes. As Orpheus emerges from the underworld, he has now entered a new phase of his life. According to Orpheus' version of the myth, after losing his wife, Orpheus forswears women and begins on to take on male lovers. Thus, Orpheus' return to the earth is also the moment of his birth into homoeroticism. Out of desire and grief, another desire is born. Out of this new desire also springs another grief, for Orpheus comes to a terrible end. Enraged by his rejection of women, the Dionysian priests attack him, tear him to pieces, and throw his head in the river. it floats, still singing, to the land of Lesbos. While not depicted by day, this gruesome torture haunts the Orpheus series. The desire of representing in a photograph is shrouded in traumatic loss. The beautiful youth is not only longing and mourned, he is mourned for and longed for, and desire is caught between grief and grief. So we can see this position next to the cave. This is Petal inside the cave of a cave in Illinois. Another image to think about is Soul of a Blasted Pine by Anne W. Brigman. Brigman's work from 1907 poetically poses a melodramatic figure within a harsh landscape. To quote from the critic of the time, would say the following: "All sense of separation between human being and nature is gone. Both seem to be part that is all beautiful in elemental conditions. In all of Brigman's symbolic studies, you feel one dominant thought, that to her there is one underlying spiritual inspiration, one just for nature and man." That interpretation leads me to believe that Brigman and Petal may have had a drink around a fire at one point in time, talking about spiritualism and talking about the landscape. Here is another kind of direct reference.
So I think it's really important to point to these visual influences, these photographic influences, but I also think that it's really important to consider the model's perspective and what it means to perform for a photographer and also to perform for the self as well. So the two sort of poetic parents that I think I always have on my shoulders, but especially in this project, are Banu Kapil and Sia Conrad. Banu in particular, does anybody know Banu's work, by the way? So definitely look it up. Yes, good for you in the back. Schizophrene, Humanimal, and Ban and Ben Liu, I think, are her best works. Particularly for her most recent book, Ban and Ben Liu, I was really inspired by the methodology that she used to write this. So the sort of crux of the book, or the main event of the book, is a riot that took place in Southall, Middlesex, in April 1979. And so the activist Blair Peach is known for participation in a protest that led to a riot. And the novel slash poetry book starts really when a schoolgirl is walking home and hears the sound of glass breaking and lays down to die on the street. And so Banu, as a way to sort of get into this mindset of the schoolgirl, did a series of performances in which she lay on the earth for a particular amount of time. The performance began to have other nuances as she was writing the book. So you may remember in New Delhi in 2012, there was a woman named Yodi Singh Pandey who was raped on a bus and thrown from the bus, and her body lay on the ground for 40 minutes before she was found. And so Banu went to New Delhi, found the place that Pandey died, and laid on the ground for 40 minutes, and then got up and wrote notes for a poem that also became text for Ban and Ben Liu. And so I was really inspired by this idea of meditation, ritual, and performance as a way to process trauma, to transform pain into something else. I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. My mother is a Southern Baptist minister. I was closeted until I was 17 years old. And so there was a way in which becoming Petal was a way to deal with all of this psychic fracture that I experienced growing up. I actually think that when you grow up in the closet, as your brain is developing, your neurology is different. It's made different by the trauma of shielding something about yourself from the people who you're supposed to be able to be most intimate with. And so looking to Banu's practice became a source of inspiration as well as fortitude as I was doing these Petal performances in rural landscapes. Sia Conrad is the other person that I really look to in my practice. Sia grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and their family was, like a family of factory workers. And there was a point in their practice where CA felt I've actually turned the way that I'm writing poetry and submitting poetry and thinking about publishing poetry into a factory. Like I'm starting to think of it in the same way that my family was thinking about producing these parts. And it's killing me. Like it's killing all the joy in the practice. It's killing my soul to do that. And so they came up with what they call the somatic poetry rituals. And these are any form of meditative, and often they have an activist bent methodologies to really return the poet to the present moment. As soon as the poet begins to find that their mind is wandering or they're sort of getting consumed in all of the professionalization of poetry, doing these rituals as a way to like return them back to the ground. I think of it as like the Zen Buddhist master when you like knock the staff on the ground and it's like, no, pay attention. The mind has gone over here, pay attention. This is what you're doing, this is where you are. So CA also has this practice in which they tend to the earth. They just won a creative capital grant for a project called Resurrect Extinct Vibration, where they tour this country and lie on the ground and try to recapture all of the vibrational frequencies that we're losing. As up to 200 species go extinct every day, we're not only losing their biological rhythms, but we're, in CA's opinion and mine too, we're losing their auric and their morphic rhythms as well. And so we're growing up in a much less rich sort of energetic frequency than people did 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And so CA does these rituals as a way to try to channel some of that energy and hold it within their body. And that became a really important touchstone for me too, thinking about Petal, this energy that I'm actually calling in and inviting to collaborate with me and to say something that I feel that I can't say alone and to move my body in these spaces in a way that I didn't feel that I had access to alone.
So why work with Philip and Petal? For me personally, I was interested in what photography could do with text and vice versa. I grew up learning disabled, with learning disabilities, with dyslexia and disability in written expression. So my fear of working with the written language was kind of met with working with Phil. But I was intrigued at the creative process that Philip was developing to create this alter ego, this persona, to write a different kind of poetry. I was intrigued by how does that look physically, by looking at an author and a character with the camera. As time went on, Petal would play a more significant role in dictating the photo shoots and writing her own words. So now, as she's writing her own words, we start seeing an acknowledgement of the observer and the photographer. So ultimately, this project kind of turns into author, character, and observer, and who has the power.
So when David and I first started talking, and I should say too that we decided, okay, yes, we're going to do something in the summer of 2014, and we didn't actually make the first photo until spring 2015. So I offer that just as a bit of advice or an invitation to really allow projects to take their time and not to rush the creative process. Because when we first started talking, the original idea was that, okay, we were curious about where Petal lived. And so we were going to create this sort of Andy Warhol factory meets Alice in Wonderland Mad Hatter party that was sort of vibrant, flamboyant, joyous, where we would invite people into the woods and Petal would be the sort of hostess figure directing everyone in their sort of celebration. And that would have been a fine idea, but I think that the project very quickly took a darker turn and a more introspective turn that was needed, and that we needed time and space to sort of figure out this is where she wants to go. So this image I really love so much because it's one of the, what I consider sort of textural or symbolic images that thread throughout the project, where even though Petal isn't there and I'm not there, both of us really are. That there's a kind of emotional interiority or a psychic reality that is present here, that so much of this project was about moving through the metaphorical thicket, moving through all of these psychic hang-ups that we all have, moving through the emotional baggage that we all have, and really dwelling in it, resting with it, beginning to unpack it. And I think that there's something about these natural landscapes that really lent themselves to that kind of material. That something more constructed or staged wouldn't have.
So in my creative practice, I try very hard to develop specific visual language for each project. I work with different cameras for each project. I work with different film. And this would be a project where I kind of continue on using black and white film, not only conceptually to relate back to the history of the medium, but also as kind of a technical issue of using grayscale to acknowledge, the black ink on white paper that Philip's writing with, but also as we started working through this project, we were doing color photographs, and we realized that Petal's kind of thrift store chic was way too colorful, and it kind of distracted away from how introspective this project was going to be. As a photographer, you kind of establish the role of selecting outfits and finding locations, and Phil and I would talk about this a lot and kind of pre-plan, but the big question was who's going to perform today? A lot of times navigating two individuals in one body, sometimes Petal wasn't going to perform, and I had to be okay with that. Trying to balance their poses of masculine or feminine and what those gestures meant was something that we had to navigate, because sometimes when Petal wasn't performing, it would just be Philip wearing her clothes and her makeup, and those images were less successful. Trying to navigate the landscape and the terrain that we are in. We tried to find locations that spoke to the soil and the trees and the muck found in the poems. We traversed through pastoral landscapes, finding moments just off water's edge. We photographed in man-made cave in Western Illinois. We'd also photograph in Midwestern residencies, which we had access to freely roam without judgment of an audience.
So the first time that I ever became Petal, I actually asked Tyler Cross, who goes by the stage name Siren, to design me, and he did an excellent job, and there is a photographic record of that by a photographer named Carly and Faye. And I love those images, but I never felt that this is really who she was. And the reason for that was that Tyler, because they are a professional drag performer, is of course using like Lush Cosmetics and MAC Cosmetics, like heavy drag makeup. And I felt honored that they used the good stuff on me, but it never felt exactly right. And I think the reason for that is because I don't feel that Petal is actually positioning genderqueerness or drag performance in an urban setting. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not who she is. Suddenly the project became much more challenging and exciting when I realized, like, oh, she wants to be in the rural. She actually wants to be in the kind of landscapes that I grew up in and actually felt ostracized from and kicked out of as a young person. Like, that's really important, to reposition the queer body and to reposition gender fluidity and reposition this idea of drag performance in the rural area. And so that became a conversation that David and I had as we were choosing locations, and it also became a conversation that I was having with myself as I was choosing how to style her. So all of her outfits come from thrift stores that I found in small cities or small towns, and all of her makeup came from Walgreens, CVS, or Walmart. And the reason for that is because I really wanted her to have, I only wanted her to have access to the kinds of products that my grandmother's mother and sister had growing up. And so she became something that was someone who was participating in drag performance and also was participating in something a little different. And then the other thing that became really important was to position me/her in spiritual settings. So this is a photo shoot that we did in a queer accepting church in St. Louis. As I mentioned, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. My mother is a Southern Baptist minister. And while I have a really good, solid relationship with my mother, around the time that I realized that I was queer, I felt that I had a choice to make. I could either be a spiritual person or I could be a sexual person. I did not feel that I could be both. And so my spiritual lineage and the sort of community, religious community that I had that was very important to me growing up suddenly was cut and severed and fractured. And so this was a really important shoot to do, to reposition myself with the sort of understanding that I am a fully queer individual, and that Petal is a full part of myself, like repositioning both of us in this kind of setting. I found incredibly healing as one of the last notes of this project.
While navigating and trying to figure out who Philip was, and I think, I could see Petal differently than Philip could see Petal. And so trying to put words to what Petal is, besides an alter ego or drag persona, we asked the question, who is Petal anyway, from my perspective? She's a poet, she's a guru, giving advice to individuals at art openings. She's a witch, a loner who'd rather toil deep in the woods. In poems, she's your lover, or she has stolen your lover. She is the sea foam rolling in and out with the tide. She is your mother, or a conjured spirit at the base of your belly.
Writing with Petal became really interesting. I think, Dave, you were talking with some of the students that you reviewed today about the permission to get like really, really weird. And I just want to say that writing with Petal, like if anybody had been observing me, they would have thought this person is insane. Because often the poems would start when I was in the shower and I would just start singing to I'm not going to do it for you. I'm never going to do it for anyone, but I would start singing these sort of like iterations, almost like chanting to myself in this really high-pitched voice that is not my own and was like a little insane, a little childlike, a little aggressive. And I was like, oh, like here she comes. There's a moment in Tony Kushner's Angels in America where Pryor like feels the angel coming in and describes it in this really visceral way, and that's kind of how it felt like. It was like the energy and the wind in the room would shift, and I would feel her coming in, and I would get out of the shower quickly or whatever I was doing and run and grab a notebook and a paper and a pen. There's no elegant way to tie that thought up. But the point is just trust the practice and trust these weird impulses that you have, and feel free to keep them private, but do listen to them.
I think trying to find, when you build a practice, like where a little bit of yourself is within the images, or a little bit of who Philip or Petal is. And there's one thing that comes in with Wig Heavier Than a Boot. At a moment in time, all three of us wore cowboy boots kind of every day, all the time, even when we were making shoots. And so that's kind of where the title started finding itself. But it also is a debate about the title and trying to determine that Phil and I may have different understandings of it. It's a role reversal. It could mean protection. It could mean a wound. It could be an optimistic notion. It could be a feminine object of allure, crushing a masculine thing. It could suggest violence, which within the titles, or within the title and within the poems. So we kind of fluctuate for what that title may mean for both of us.
I'm going to read, I mentioned that I wrote performance notes during all of these shoots. And earlier this year, David asked me to put together a bit of writing for a presentation that we couldn't do together. And I drew from some of those performance notes and sort of crystallized them into something that could be used. And I just want to read them for you. So sometimes I wear Petal, like a devotee might wear the clothes of his god. But Petal also has her own life without me. During the collaboration with David, Petal was not always willing to appear. And some of the most exciting photographs for me are those where her reluctance or refusal to perform is evident. Or this photograph, where she redirects the gaze onto the photographer, asking him to be seen by her, a kind of vengeance on the one hand, and on the other, a generosity, the subject asking the photographer to embody the act of being seen, to know what that feels like, her own will beginning to shape the project and the body she is being called to inhabit. Most recently, when she appears, she comes through ritual elements, a stone, rosemary, a gull's feather, a chain, or she's invisible, an open electricity in the room, reawakening in me a question I had throughout this collaboration: for whom is the performance of this body? Mostly for myself, an attempt to reconcile a sense of belonging as a queer person to the place I'm from and the family I belong to. But also for anyone who happens to cross upon us in isolated, expansive landscapes, the only home, it turns out, Petal needs, and the performance for you, seeing her now. The project for me has always been about time, ritual time in which I ask Petal to be present for increasingly longer durations, taking her own to write a different kind of poetry, to be a different kind of witch, more sure of his power, less ashamed, to claim my body and poetry to extents I could not manage or imagine alone. And the different modes of time in which photography and poetry are made, allowing those infrastructures to speak to each other. Sometimes David could see Petal's presence more clearly than I could feel her. Don't move, he would say, and we wouldn't. Sometimes I could hear what she wanted, and I would try to convey that to David. She wants to touch the Christmas trees. She says they're her grandmother's, or she wants to baptize herself. In the fall of 2017, David and I went to the rooftop of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis, where I used to curate public programs. We had decided to do one last shoot, without Petal this time, to try to reassert something of our own presences into the project. Perched on the ledge of the bamboo garden, I had the sudden impulse to lie face down in the plant, and understood then that I had integrated something of Petal's style. I hadn't consciously called her, but here she was anyway, wearing my clothes, wearing my beard, showing me what to do. Here I am, I think now as I write this, in the tone of a child surprising his mother.
There's an excellent gift in collaboration when you learn somebody else's practice, how they select things, and working with Philip as a poet, knowing how he picks words and phrases and reminds from things back from earlier in his career. As a photographer, I was very siloed in the way that I work, and this photograph fits within this box and it never shall leave that box. Working with Philip opened up the opportunity to engage photographs in different ways. As an example, this photograph was made in Iowa 2 years before we would even work together, but is a perfect example of the landscape we felt Petal would occupy. Or this photograph made in Texas was part of another series, but found a home within this series.
And I think on that note, I have a viewing copy of the book with me, so please come up after if you want to see it. I mentioned this before, the project is ekphrastic in the sense that, yes, there is text, and text is responding to image. But most of the time, when we talk about ekphrastic writing, the image already exists, and the image is given to the poet, and the task is, okay, now respond to this. And it was really important for both of us that that one-to-one relationship wasn't going to confine what was going to happen here. So both forms are really made in the present, and the container was much more mutable and freeing than I think most ekphrastic projects are. And so in the book, yes, there's an arc of the poems and there's an arc of the photographs, but all of the electricity within those two infrastructures are left to merge as whole organisms. So you don't have this sort of rhythm of 1-1, 1-1, 1-1, 1-1. You have something that's much more fluid and much more, I think, natural and organic. And maybe, since we're looking at this image, it's like, it's more tide-like, right? It's not constricted, but it's constantly flowing in a kind of like rhythm that is both linear and cyclical. This was the hardest photograph to take. This was in Fort Macon in North Carolina. So I invited David home with me in the winter of 2015, and that was important because it was the first time that my family had met Petal. And we went to Fort Macon, and I really did think because it was the winter and it was cold that nobody was going to be there, and quite the opposite actually, like there were tons of veterans and their families visiting for the holidays. And I freaked out for a minute because you can't see it in this picture, but this wig is bright purple. The makeup that I had on was, purple lipstick, like very heavy eyes. And I just didn't know how it was going to go. I was a little afraid, to be honest. But it ended up being a really important experience because it was a moment in which the project had done exactly what I wanted it to do, what I was trying to feel into, where I felt, actually, I belong here as much as anybody else here, and who cares? And people, I think, were a little curious or not. And it felt to me like, oh, maybe something really has or is socially shifting, where I can be, that Petal can be here and really nobody cares that she's here. Like that seemed a really positive thing to me.
And observing the way in which Philip and Petal were uncomfortable in this situation really stirred some questions within me. I had to learn to check my privilege. Here I am photographing a gay man as a genderqueer persona within a landscape. Am I just another white straight male objectifying another body in another landscape? I would ask Phil this question, and his response, to put it bluntly, was fuck no. I'm surprised that you'd even want to do a project like this with me. Further conversations with Phil and my friends relieve those concerns. Many agree with Phil that change can happen much quicker when more men like me discuss and share ideas like this. Going back all the way to Float, at times I had to relinquish my role as a photographer and let Petal take over and trust her. I hope that this work speaks to my desire to be an ally and an advocate for LGBTQ rights, and promote awareness and continue on with the discussion. Where'd we go? I'll scroll through the last couple of images. Here's some installation shots of how our exhibitions look. We try to bring in video because it's really hard to ask a viewer in a museum to read. And so the video work are recordings of Philip. This is a video of him shaving. I asked him to grow his beard for several months. And it's this powerful moment of him clawing at the facial hair while Petal is reciting a poem about motherhood. Cover of our book. And we'll be having an exhibition in St. Louis and in Houston. Philip's book, Alice, is coming out in April 2020. Follow us on Instagram for more information. But questions? Yeah.
Whereas the pictures of you seem like oriented to the present, Petal seems like more of an unspecific or archetypal place and time. Can you expand more on that?
Maybe. I love that you saw that.
Can I take that?
Yeah, please.
All right, so another project that I have is photographing an 18-day-long music festival where my practice is really interested in a vernacular time and looking at, since it's a folk music festival, looking at Dust Bowl ballads by Woody Guthrie during the Dust Bowl, during the Great Depression, while the Farm Security Administration were making photographs and trying to blur what time periods we're in. And for me, Petal doesn't sit with just our time period. I think she moves through time much differently than we may. And that's something that was very much tied to how I've worked in other projects and how I wanted this project to come out. I'm glad you noticed that.
Yeah. The thing that immediately when you said that, the thing that I immediately thought of was I binged in 2017 Transparent. And that show really became exciting to me with Allie's character, where she's like moving through time. And I do think that there's something to that. In that case, it's about a character who is working with intergenerational trauma. And that is the reason that she has this mutability, time mutability to her. And maybe there's something to that as well. So much of my writing, and I'm really feeling it now as the two books are coming out, and also I'm doing a form of death work for my family right now, and so I'm around them every day. I'm understanding the way in which what I write about is place and family and positioning to place and family. And so I'm just very aware of all of these patterns that have been inherited through my family, and sort of the ways in which they still play out. The ways in which things that have never been resolved, it's they don't go away, they just become the next generation's problem. And so I don't have a very detailed answer for that question, but it is a question that I think I'm also having to. The ways in which, okay, how does Petal fit into not only myself, but also my family? If I am experiencing myself in this sort of bifurcated way, what does that mean for me, but also what does it mean for my relationships? Yeah.
So this is kind of a follow-up, but I was wondering also, as watching, did you ever, or how might you talk about what you discovered about where Petal lives? That's one part. That's a big one. And then another question that I had was, it just seems like, from my perspective, work that's really personal takes a certain type of courage. And like, could you talk about that a little bit? Like,
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of different kinds of artists. We all don't work that way.
Yeah.
How do you? And I mean, both of you.
Yeah. I mean, for that second question, I mean, thank you for that. For me, I think it really is just a kind of work that I happen to make. Ask me again, like in a year, when these books really are out in the world. Like I'm having a bit of anxiety, like looking at the poems. It's just like, yeah, okay, I really did just say that about my father, and like he's gonna read it, and like so is everybody else. What about that? But I kind of feel like I don't have a choice. It's, you know, the poems will what they want. Petal certainly has always wanted what she wanted, and I feel like my job is to listen. And to respond to that, like not to sound so woo about it, but it feels that way to me. Like the poems in a lot of ways, like they really don't have anything to do with me. Even though they do, even though they are so personal and so vulnerable, it's like I actually really do experience practice as a kind of like invocation and channeling. It's how I've always, you know, in piano performance, we were talking about that earlier. It's how I experience piano performance as well, where it's like, yeah, like use my body, use my voice, but it is something else that is coursing through me in that moment. And it's not all the time, you know, it's like each poem is a container in which that energy has come in and then comes out. I think you get in trouble when it doesn't go back out. Yeah, so that is a way around answering this question. But that's my answer. Is that what choice do I have?
Oh, I'm supposed to say, I get so caught up just listening to Phil talk. It's beautiful. I mean, for me, I had never been a photographer that photographed one person. And also, I had never been a photographer that was willing to participate and be in front of the camera and be vulnerable. And it was a no-brainer. Like we were in the car, or we're like, oh, you have to get naked now. Yeah, well, like that. It's part of the project. So I think that I've stared at Phil and photographs of Phil Petal more than I've looked at anything else. So there's an intimacy within that. And you know, I'm grateful to have a willing participant that is not just a model, but a peer and somebody to work through. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, just towards the end of your book, you both started to blur the line between you and Petal.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that blurring is going to continue in your work?
I think she's gone. And by that I mean like that she's not showing up as a character, as a persona, as a noun entity in the poems anymore. And I think part of that is because I really do think that a piece of my psyche had fractured. And I named it Petal and called out to it, and you know, this entire project, and also part of which too was about suturing that back up. And now it has been. And so good, right? Like that's a check on my karmic healing work, like that's done. And so there's a way in which like becoming her in this way is not important anymore. People have asked me like, oh, now that the books are out, are you going to tour as Petal? And it's very important to me that the answer is no. Because at this point, if I did that, it would be marketing, and fuck that. Like I can't think of a worse thing to do. If it was still important to be her and perform as her, then the answer would be yes. But in fact, like conceptually, like at the heart of the project, like it's resolved. It is a resolved project. So in a way, she's gone, but in a way, like it was always me. And that actually is the part in the practice that is now getting really scary and vulnerable and interesting. Because I'm doing this work with my family, the practice is veering into nonfiction. And these are like, yeah, they're personal and they're semi-autobiographical, but you can always stand behind that little mask of like, it's the speaker, it's not me. More and more, it's like, no, it's me. And that I'm having a lot of feelings about. Yeah.
Thank you so much.